Opening the door for kingside development, this knight boldly stakes a claim in the center, preparing for a flexible response to black's initial strategy. Asserting central space early, this establishes a robust pawn presence, immediately contesting white's freedom of development and hinting at a positional struggle for dominion. Establishing central dominance and challenging black's pawn, white fortifies their space and opens lines for active piece play. Developing knights early, black secures central influence and prepares for kingside castling, eyeing kingside space. Launching a central pawn storm, white aggressively contests space and prepares a direct confrontation for control of the board. Solidifying the center pawns, black opts for a robust Slav-like structure, preparing to develop pieces harmoniously. Asserting central control further, this knight boldly stakes its claim near the d5 pawn, preparing for eventual pawn advances or piece play. Sacrificing the pawn immediately creates dynamism, though it potentially cedes the center's structural advantage. Boldly grabbing space on the queen side prevents black's bishop from finding comfort on a new square. Developing the bishop to f5 initiates a bold challenge, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize central influence early. A bold advance, this knight to e5 aggressively challenges black's central control and aims to disrupt their harmony, potentially forcing concessions or setting up a tactical skirmish. Watch out for pawn sacrifices on the queen side as white seeks compensation for the pawn deficit. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing to develop the king's bishop, this move neatly addresses the knight's intrusion, creating a harmonious setup and keeping options open for further development. Shielding the king's path with a pawn sacrifice, this move creates a somewhat awkward pawn structure that might hinder development and limit the queen's scope. Aggressively challenging the knight's outpost on e5, this bishop maneuver seeks to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. The bishop's placement creates immediate tactical tension, forcing white to address the doubled pawns on the c-file or allow the knight to be exchanged. Boldly seizing the center, this aggressive thrust aims to displace black's bishop and gain a decisive pawn advantage, potentially opening lines towards the enemy king and dictating the game's tempo. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn creates immediate tactical chaos, potentially opening lines toward the king while giving up a key defender of the queen side. Capturing the bishop on e4 opens up the f-file for your rook and offers immediate compensation for the pawn deficit. You're embracing tactical complexity now, creating imbalances that could lead to dynamic play. Be mindful of the weakened kingside pawn structure, though. It might become a target later. Reclaiming the knight opens up a fascinating tactical skirmish. You're actively challenging the center and creating dynamic piece play, forcing white to confront the unleashed tension you've engineered. Developing the bishop here offers white a flexible pawn structure, potentially leading to advantageous exchanges later, while also securing the king's diagonal and preparing for a castling maneuver, though it does cede some central space to black's knights. Unveiling the queen to claim the pawn creates immediate central pressure, but also exposes her to potential harassment from white's developing pieces, forcing black into a defensive posture rather than pursuing active piece play. Seizing the opportunity, white liberates the knight, initiating a critical central exchange that opens lines and forces black into a defensive posture, potentially disrupting their planned development and creating weaknesses around their king. Black seizes the initiative by forking the king and rook, forcing white's hand in a critical moment where control of the center is paramount. Unlocking a dynamic central presence, the queen boldly ventures forth, immediately challenging black's potentially exposed king and setting the stage for a tactical fireworks display. Sacrificing the bishop here might seem appealing to simplify and potentially exploit the exposed king, but it critically opens up the diagonal for white's queen to join the attack more aggressively, while black's own queen becomes somewhat passive after the exchange. The immediate exchange of bishops, while seemingly neutralizing a threat, actually grants white valuable tempo and initiative. Instead of pursuing a quick material grab, a more cautious approach, perhaps reinforcing the center or developing a piece to a more active square, would have preserved black's positional advantages. This decision prioritizes simplification over strategic development, which can be a dangerous gamble when the king is already a target. Securing the king's safety amidst the unleashed tactical storm becomes paramount, as the monarch now navigates a landscape far more exposed than mere minutes ago. A check that forces the opposing king into a precarious, exposed square, initiating a dramatic sequence where the Black Queen, though momentarily powerful, may find itself the centerpiece of a dangerous tactical dance. Relocating the monarch to the safety of the c-file, a calculated risk, sidestepping potential checks and freeing the d-pawn, while implicitly acknowledging the board's inherent instability and the king's newfound isolation. The knight's journey to the edge of the board, while appearing passive, subtly sets a trap by eyeing the weak c5 square and potentially preparing a surprising leap to b4, which would reintroduce threats to the recently moved king. Pouncing on Black's misplaced knight, White seizes a crucial central outpost, opening up attacking avenues and relieving the early pressure on their king. Seizing the open c-file with the rook immediately aims to exploit the exposed enemy king and the awkward placement of White's own king, creating dynamic counterplay on the queen's side. Centralizing the queen, the monarch now retreats to a safer haven, aiming to consolidate the pawn structure and prepare for a potential rook lift. Consolidating the king's safety on this precarious side of the board becomes paramount. The knight's repositioning to a6, while seemingly passive, opens up avenues for future piece activity, potentially targeting the vulnerable white queen and disrupting White's already complex pawn structure, aiming to create long-term positional imbalances. Unleashing a central pawn push here, b2, aims to unlock the bishop's diagonal and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance, while also contesting the active squares around the enemy monarch. Securing the king within the castle walls, the monarch retreats to a more sheltered position, anticipating potential checks down the central files and seeking to coordinate defense. Aimed at disrupting Black's pawn shield and creating attacking chances on the kingside, this advance seeks to gain space and open lines for White's pieces, although it does commit a pawn and could create weaknesses. Black's king is alarmingly exposed on the queen's side, and this pawn advance, while defending the knight, seems to surrender even more critical central space. It's a rather passive response that doesn't address the fundamental problem of White's initiative and attacking potential. The resulting pawn structure on the kingside now appears rather compromised, potentially creating weaknesses down the road. Rethinking the approach after the prolonged struggle for central space, this brings the rook into the fray on the now open d-file, a crucial conduit for imposing pressure on Black's potentially vulnerable king setup and simultaneously contesting control of a key open file that could prove decisive. Suddenly, the queen, seemingly on an excursion, makes a bold dash to g2, placing immense pressure on the exposed white king and demanding immediate attention. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical diagonal for the queen and exposes the black king, forcing immediate defensive concessions. Relying on the open d-file, Black aims to consolidate their material advantage and coordinate their remaining forces against White's exposed monarch. Suddenly, White seizes the initiative on the open d-file, forcing a decisive reckoning with the exchange of queens. This maneuver aims to simplify into an endgame where White's potentially more active pieces, especially the rook on the open file, can be leveraged for an advantage, while simultaneously removing Black's most powerful attacking piece, the queen, from the board. The pursuit of the seemingly trapped white queen has led Black's king into a precarious central position, exposing it to swift attacks. Unlocking the open d-file for relentless pressure on Black's vulnerable king, this offers a potent strategic thrust. The rook on b8 shifts to a less active position, potentially overlooking the critical central files where White's remaining rook now reigns supreme, while Black's king remains exposed in the labyrinth of the queenside castled structure, begging for an attack that White seems poised to deliver. Pushing the flank pawn here aims to restrict Black's queenside pieces, specifically preventing the knight from finding a better square or supporting any infiltration. Securing the knight on a6 with the nc7 pawn push is a prudent decision, creating a safe haven for the piece and preparing to redeploy it to more active squares. This maneuver not only safeguards the knight from immediate threats, but also begins a subtle repositioning that could challenge white's centralized pieces. The king's safety is paramount, and while black's king is somewhat exposed on the queen side, this knight maneuver, coupled with the pawn advance, starts building defensive fortifications. Observe how this seemingly simple repositioning might influence the control of central squares and the potential for future pawn breaks. Pinning the knight to the king's safety offers a temporary reprieve, but the underlying vulnerability of black's monarch remains a pressing concern. White's king, while a bit exposed, is significantly safer than its counterpart. This is a delicate balancing act where the sacrificed material for black might not yield enough attacking impetus to justify the king's exposed position. The open files now pose a significant threat to black's coordination, and the newly activated knight on b6 will look to exploit any further weaknesses. Sacrificing the knight for the pawn on b6 throws the pawn structure into disarray and opens a critical file for white's rook. But it fatally exposes black's king to a direct assault by the queen and rook now that the usual defensive pawn chain is broken. Unlocking the file with the pawn storm now dramatically opens lines toward black's castled king, initiating a potential mating attack and exploiting the awkward placement of the knight. Reclaiming the knight to the file, while seemingly passive, aims to re-establish some defensive presence and potentially find a respite for the beleaguered king, though it offers little immediate counterplay against white's consolidated queenside pressure and control of the d-file. Suddenly, the white rook penetrates the enemy position on the open file, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and exploit the exposed monarch. A bold attempt to regain initiative, but the rook's journey to the open file feels premature given the lingering threats around your king, potentially leading to a swift dismantling of your defensive structure if white can exploit the now exposed diagonal. Unleashing a potent queen sacrifice, aimed at shattering the pawn shield around black's exposed monarch. A surprising retreat, the queen sacrifices her central presence to avoid an immediate capture and to regroup, aiming to potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure on the kingside after white's aggressive pawn push. A swift pawn sacrifice ripping open the queenside, creating a decisive invasion point for the rook on the now open file, fundamentally altering the endgame dynamics and forcing a critical defensive concession from black. Black's king, now exposed to the open diagonal, feels the chilling pressure as white's rook on a1 pierces through the defense, aiming to dominate the 8th rank and sever any hope of counterplay. Sacrificing the queen here forces a decisive exchange, ushering in a simplified position where white holds a material advantage and a clear path to victory. The focus shifts to exploiting the open files and the exposed black king. The king suddenly finds itself exposed, a lonely sentinel in the rapidly clearing center. The rook's repositioning to the 3rd rank cleverly prepares to exploit the open file and potentially harass the black king, which is still somewhat exposed on the queen side. Sensing an opportunity, black injects some much-needed activity into the center, aiming to disrupt white's entrenched queen's bishop and potentially open lines for their rook, though it might create a slight structural weakness on the queen side in the long run. A bold assertion of the b-file's dominance, this maneuver seeks to capitalize on the recent exchange of queens by creating a dynamic pressure point. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now aims to create a more resilient defense against white's queenside pressure, though it does cede some queenside space, and could lead to passive play if not supported by active piece maneuvering. Seizing the open file, RB5 aims to cramp black's position and create threats against the isolated pawn on c5, potentially forcing it forward and creating weaknesses. The knight's relocation to the queenside offers a subtle yet crucial counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create avenues for the rook. Observe how the knight, once a defender, now postures as an attacker, seeking to exploit the open c-file and the isolated pawn. This proactive placement prevents white from unilaterally dominating the board and forces them to consider black's emerging counter-threats. Solidifying that bishop's presence here opens up a subtle threat to penetrate black's remaining pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later in this rook and pawn endgame transition. Unleashing a bold pawn advance, black aims to seize initiative on the queen side, creating immediate spatial pressure and a potential infiltration point for the rook. This is the moment to seize the initiative, leveraging the rook's presence on the open file to create a decisive advantage. By pushing the b-pawn, white aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for the queen and king to infiltrate. It's a calculated risk, as it weakens the queenside pawn chain, but the promise of a breakthrough justifies the gamble. The goal is to force concessions from black, whether that means sacrificing material to prevent further progress or allowing white to establish a dominant position. This move should be viewed not just as a pawn advance, but as an attempt to crack open the position and exploit any latent weaknesses. Generating counterplay on the queen side by creating a passed pawn opportunity is a bold, though potentially risky, endeavor given the current pawn structure and white's active rook. The rook's aggressive lunge onto the fifth rank seizes immediate control of an open file, disrupting black's pawn structure and creating threats against the weak king. The rook's repositioning to the sixth rank now directly challenges white's vulnerable pawn structure, potentially creating immediate threats along the open files and forcing a difficult defensive response. Unlocking the g-file and creating immediate pawn tension, white boldly initiates a dramatic pawn exchange that opens critical lines for their rook and potentially exposes the black king's shelter. Embracing the inevitable recapture, black allows white to solidify a precarious pawn majority on the queen side, setting the stage for an endgame where the open files will become paramount. A decisive pawn capture, finally resolving the queenside tension and opening a clear path for your rook to infiltrate the enemy camp. This action transforms a passive position into one brimming with attacking potential, targeting the weakened enemy pawn structure. Re-entering the fray with the rook after the exchange, black aims to activate the piece into the open files created. However, the position demands immediate attention to the persistent threat against the king. This passive redeployment concedes valuable tempo and allows white's monarch to consolidate further, potentially leading to a dangerous central pawn push. Navigating your king to safety now becomes the primary directive, seeking refuge on the queen side where the open files pose less immediate peril to your monarch. A desperate gambit to inject some life into a clearly losing endgame. This aggressive check aims to disrupt white's now solidifying pawn structure and potentially create counterplay by forcing the king into a more exposed position, though the material deficit remains an insurmountable hurdle. The white king boldly steps into the fray, aiming to solidify its presence on the d4 square and disrupt black's rook's newfound activity along the open file, while simultaneously eyeing the pawn structure. Exploring the pawn chain's influence on the queen side, black seeks to leverage the open b-file for potential counterplay after the rook exchange, a subtle shift towards an endgame where active pieces will be paramount. The king's journey toward the center begins, a daring sortie into the chaos of this fractured position. The knight's aggressive foray into the enemy camp, forcing a pawn sacrifice, sets a dangerous trap, as the subsequent discovered attack on the queen can lead to immediate material disaster if not handled with extreme precision. Harnessing the king's newfound activity, white steps forward, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create mating threats on the king side.